Good evening, Mayor, Pro Tem, council members in the community. I am Tim Bokum, City Traffic Engineer, and I will be giving the presentation on railroad quiet zones and what they may mean to the city of Oxnard. Tonight's recommendation is simply that the Public Works Transportation Committee and then City Council receive and file this report on the background issues of what constitutes a Federal Railroad Administration quiet zone and how they are established, and then if necessary, provide feedback to staff on those issues. Tonight we'll talk about what quiet zones are and a little bit about what they are not. Talk a little bit about the history of train horn zones and how quiet zones came about and the reasoning for the national program. We'll talk about what criteria is applied in trying to establish a quiet zone within a certain area, that process that the Federal Railroad Administration requires us to follow, some of the countermeasures and improvements that may be necessary in order to achieve a quiet zone designation in that process. And then I'll finish up by really showing two things, some city examples of how those countermeasures might need to be applied in order to move forward with a quiet zone. And then I thought it would be good for the council and the community to see at least one report on a quiet zone assessment that has been conducted to give you an idea of what we would want to produce in order to consider quiet zone implementation here in the city. And I'll finish up with the next steps that may be necessary if in fact we move forward. First of all, just a very high-level explanation of what a quiet zone is. Really, a quiet zone is nothing more than a zone that has been created to cease the routine sounding of horns as a warning mechanism in that area. Again, the word routine is very important because there are instances where a train horn may be required, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And in that zone, it's where improvements have been made to reduce the risk at or below the current operation when a train is in session. And again, what it's not, a quiet zone is not where there will be absolutely no potential pedestrian trespass across a facility or vehicle. The engineer must sound that horn as a warning mechanism, so it's not an absolute. A little bit about history. Well, as I'm sure everybody's aware, the train, intercontinental train tracks have been here for many, many years, decades, centuries. There's been conflicts all along those times, but really in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, as the interstate highway system was being completed and many of the residential developments and the growths were occurring, more and more conflicts were occurring and more audible conflicts were occurring with the railroads. And so beginning in the 70s, but actually a little bit before that, really becoming prevalent in the 70s, many jurisdictions were starting their own process of trying to eliminate train horns. So there was multiple ordinances, multiple code measures being established throughout the nation with really no uniformity. And so railroad operators were encountering apple and orange operation requests throughout the nation. And then culminating in the early 90s, Congress mandated that the Federal Railroad Administration take this issue on and come up with a unified code of regulations for both the operation of train horns throughout the United States, as well as the potential establishment of quiet zones that may be implemented. It took about a good 10 years of soliciting feedbacks and rules and going through the process again and again and again. 1994 to 2003, the Federal Railroad Administration worked on those rule regulations, and then really in 2005 adopted the Federal Register 44222 that establishes when and where a locomotive engineer should sound the horns, primarily 15 to 20 seconds in advance of a crossing. But there are some variations in that. There was a whole number of regulations of how railroads should operate as part of this regulation. But in that code of regulation, also were the provisions of how we would establish quiet zones in order to make them uniform throughout the nation. And that, of course, is what's known commonly as the train horn rule these days, and what we'll be talking about tonight. Some very general requirements in order to establish quiet zones. Only local governments or public agents may establish those quiet zones. The Federal Railroad Administration didn't want private entities, farmlands, others out there requesting the creation of quiet zones. They really rely specifically on local governments to do that process. In general, a half-mile length is required. And for the city of Oxnard, that may be a little challenging because we have some segments that have a lot of crossings at a quarter-mile length, and then some that don't have very many at all, or maybe in close proximity residential development or not. And then in that half-mile length, there has to be at least one public crossing, although I don't know the rational figure that the only time they would be sounding their horn is for a crossing, but there obviously was conditions where that may not have been the case. There's probably not any locations in Oxnard where we wouldn't have at least one crossing within a half mile, so that we don't really need to worry about that particular provision. And then really what needs to be done is that every public crossing, every private crossing, every pedestrian crossing that's in that zone, whatever it is, really needs to have upgrades occur at the crossing locations to make sure that it's at least as safe as the pre-horn sounding conditions. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But you achieve that by doing countermeasures out there. You upgrade your gates and your flashing lights in order to be more warning for vehicles that are approaching. You might be putting in gates entirely across the street so they can't go around, they physically can't drive through. You want to give the railroad engineers as much information as you can. So power out indicators are required in order to let them know that everything's functioning at an intersection, or it should be. And then many of the times the installation of what's called constant warning time detectors is needed. A simple explanation of that is simply that these are devices along the railroad tracks that allow the gates and the preemption to start in proximity to how quickly a train is approaching. If you can visualize a train slowly towards a crossing and yet the gates go down at the same time, regardless of speed, there may be a condition where people say, well, the gates have malfunctioned, I want to drive around these. Constant warning time detectors adjust that time when it comes down to make sure that they only come down as the train is approaching the requirement. And that would be something else that would be necessary. This is probably the most important premise of the quiet zones that I'd like the council to understand. We must, a public agency must, certify the administration that we meet one of two criteria. First, we install improvements at each crossing location within the quiet zone that is at least equal to or the same risk, quote unquote, the risk, as the current train horn operations. In the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how that is seen visually. Or as an alternative strategy, that our safety index, by whatever we put in out there, is below, not at, but below the National Safety Risk Index. And to explain those a little bit further is just this slide in the equations at the bottom, but I'll walk you through it. The National Significant Risk Threshold is a value that the Federal Railroad Administration comes up with annually. It's basically a predictive model is used based on things such as vehicle volumes, train volumes, the rate of collisions that have occurred in a certain time period. And each year a number is produced to say this is the national average of what the risk threshold is at our public crossings. And so one concept is to have your quiet zone at least, or actually below that threshold. And so you are guaranteeing, or at least saying, that we believe the quiet zone is at least as safe or actually below, safer than the national average. The second way to do it is by what is the quiet risk zone, the risk index with horn. And this is another value that's produced by the Federal Railroad Administration that basically takes into consideration everything in that quiet zone when a horn is sounded. And it basically comes up with a value that has been predetermined throughout the United States for each crossing. And then a local jurisdiction needs to go through at each one of the crossings and improve them to at least meet that risk index with horns, if not better it. And generally, as a rule of thumb, you want to make it better so you have some cushion there. So at the bottom in the red, you can see sort of the two premise equations. You want your new quiet zone index, your risk in that quiet zone on the left, to be below the national standard risk index. And then in the bottom, you would need that quiet zone risk index to at least be as safe or as effective as the train horns, if not better. Now, the one significant difference between those two, if in fact you use the national average, every year that number changes, obviously, because they've got new numbers, new things that are happening. And so there is the possibility that your index, your quiet zone index, pops up above the national index because things change. So annually, you need to go back and review that to make sure that you stay within those premises. And then I believe it's you have to study in full to make sure you're below it again. The process can be long and involved, but it's simplistic by design. I won't walk you through everything on this, but this is just a pictorial of how the process is to go about. And up here, step one, a public authority identifies grade crossings that we may include in a quiet zone analysis. Some diagnostic reviews can be done with state and railroad operators to sort of get a list of things that we might want to do and perceive to sort of get a ballpark judgment of what it might take to establish a quiet zone. Sometimes that's a risk assessment report that's prepared. Sometimes it may be individual reports. That information is then analyzed, and if a jurisdiction wants to proceed with that quiet zone, there's a filing of a notice of intent to create a quiet zone. And then the operators and stakeholders within that area have 60 days to sort of review and comment on that notice of intent. The following step is a big one. That's when the heavy work takes place to do the engineering design of the construction and countermeasures that would be necessary in order to create the improvements to take that risk index below the train horn or the national average. And that could mean initial work being necessary either all at one time or staged over a period of time in order to make that happen, to bring the entire quiet zone up to standards of improvements in order to exceed those of the train horns. Basically, the improvements would then need to take place, and you would get ready to establish the quiet zone. Once we are ready to certify, or an agency is ready, that is ready, we file a notice of final quiet zone creation, and then the operators have 21 days before they have to cease the use of train horn in those areas. Throughout this process, stakeholders are actively engaged, whether railroad operators or adjacent property owners or private crossing owners. They need to be included in each one of these stages in order to be effective. And then really the only thing that I would point out over on this side of the table is the difference between what is called supplementary safety measures or alternative safety measures. The first category, the supplemental safety measures, and I'll show you some on the following slide, those are pre-approved, pre-calculated safety improvements that the Federal Railroad Administration already accepts as countermeasures to train horn activity. The alternative safety measures are ones that a local jurisdiction may come up with, that the Federal Railroad Administration may want to consider, but it has to go through a process of review and acceptance or rejection, and also a calculation of the risk benefit associated with it. So the alternative safety measure has a separate process that has to be undertaken. Here's some examples of supplemental safety measures that the Federal Railroad Administration has already approved. I'll walk through a couple of these for the council. On the left is a 4-quadrant gating system, and so you can see not only do they have the standard gate that comes down, but the 4-quadrant gates actually close off all directions in both, with pre and post gating, time to let a vehicle get through and leave that area before the post gate comes down. In that way, it's sufficient to keep vehicles from driving around an actuated gate that's only on the right-hand side. This example also, you can see here, has a pedestrian gate connection. It holds pedestrians from crossing at the time a train comes through. But that is not a requirement of a train quiet zone area, but it is good practice to analyze the pedestrian movements out there. On the upper right is an installation where a median has been installed with only the right-hand gating. And this is to keep vehicles from actually driving around those deployed gates and actually getting across. It's a lower cost measure, but it also has possibilities of violations, as you can see. It drives either over or around this and is willing to do that. It can't 100% guarantee that people won't do that. And so it's a lower, less improvement of a risk reduction technology as opposed to a full quadrant. And then if you take that a step further and you don't have enough money or you don't want to install a median through the area because of right-of-way issues or cost, you may look at doing a hybrid installation where channel might be used. The downside of this is obviously there's a high operating cost and maintenance cost associated with it because they will get knocked down. And so a local agency, because they would take this on as one of their requirements to maintain this device, has to be out there continuously, making sure that these things are reinstalled if they're hit. Still doing in nature the same thing as an installed median might do, just with less cost. Converting to one-way streets, that is a possibility in certain areas, not with the city of Oxnard possibly, but in others. Reason that's effective is you still only have the two gating system, but because it's a one-way street, it's now controlling both approaches, so nobody can drive around those, and that reduces the risk analysis there without as much cost. The trade-off, of course, on that is your circulation changes, and you have to take that into consideration of where people are going to go. And then things like closures, like these two, or even a grade separation like the city's doing at 5th, Rice and 5th, are ways of totally removing the potential for a vehicle train collision. And so when you see those scoring rates, they totally reduce to almost zero the risk associated with it. So you have 100% reduction effectiveness value on those. I believe table 4 in your report is sort of a matrices that shows some of those safety measures that are out and available. These are ones that the Federal Railroad Administration has looked at and has already pre-calculated, as I said, a effectiveness rate reduction. It's interesting, you'll see the ones down at the bottom, the closures, circulation changes, grade separation, all carry a value of 1. The higher the better here, because the 1 is 100% reduction in the risk value from train horn operations, because you're physically removing a vehicle and a train conflict potential. And then, of course, on the other ones, there's a variety of risk potential effectiveness rates that are there depending on if, in fact, they fully restrict vehicle traffic or only partially. And these are ones that could be chosen to help establish grade crossings in Oxnard if a quiet zone is moved forward. And then I just took a very high-level approach at what the general cost might be based on some information that we looked at. But for quadrant gating systems, new signal telemetry, communications, those type of installations on approaches can be expensive, somewhere between $500 to $1 million for an arterial street, maybe less than that for a 2-lane road out in some of our residential areas or arterial streets that aren't carrying multiple lanes of traffic. But when you're looking at just median installations and those type of things, there still may be right-of-way costs associated with it. They may be a construction cost trade-off or operating cost, maintenance cost that would need to be looked at. So the council can use this just as a general rule of thumb of the cost versus the effectiveness rates. Just a quick summary, I would imagine that most of the council and the community know the operators in the area, but we primarily have Pacific runs the main line, the Class 1 freight carrier along the area. They also do have passenger operations along the lines that they allow Metrolink and Amtrak to use their mainline facility for coastal passenger trains. Ventura County Railroad is our short line railroad in the area. They primarily operate between the port and downtown Oxnard and properties in between where they're shipping product to and from both the port of Hueneme, but also some of the local areas, and they're interacting with the mainline railroad in downtown. That line for Ventura County Railroad is just over about 12 miles along. They have many more crossings, both public and private, than the UP line. Many of those crossings, or some of those crossings, are private on these lines that would also need to be reviewed. Just a map that shows those two operating locations. Ventura County Railroad has the hubs and the routing mostly in the southern part of the city. The Union Pacific Railroad obviously comes down the coast, enters the Oxnard Transportation Center, and then heads east out along the county lines and then into the Los Angeles area. The Federal Railroad Safety Map, this map shows the current number of crossings Federal Railroad Administration, the FRA database. So depending on if a quiet zone was chosen in the city, each one of these crossings would need to be analyzed in that zone. So as an example, if the city wanted to establish a quiet zone in the southern part of the city, we would be looking at these these crossings for quiet zone satisfaction. And that may include other jurisdictions such as the Hueneme or the county or any other crossings that may be in close proximity but not within the jurisdiction of the city of Oxnard. The Union Pacific line has less crossings. However, operating speeds along the UP line are higher than the Ventura County Railroad line. And so those things would need to be taken into consideration if we're looking at quiet zones along those areas. And again, this is just a map from our GIS showing the actual public crossings that we have within the city of Oxnard. And you can see they're fairly spread out through the southern and the northern parts of the city. But as you get into the city downtown area, a number of crossings, a quiet zone in these areas would require many of those to be reviewed and guaranteed to have upgrades in order to meet the quiet zone safety measures. So with talking about safety measures, I just wanted to present some that would give you the visual representation of the complexities that we would be looking at. No solutions here, but I'll talk a little bit about what would be required. But some of the background elements here, this is obviously, this is Wooley and E Street. It is a fully passive crossing. There's no gating system there to keep vehicles from coming across or pedestrians from coming across. The southbound approach here literally has been striped in order to force turn only. However, there is no fixed curbing or anything that prohibits them from doing that. So anybody that wants to violate could basically drive around it and come through here. You can see we have a pedestrian crossing, a school crossing in this location without any kind of signal work. Very limited right-of-way in this cross-section of Wooley. And those would all come together and have to be addressed if we move forward. But if a quiet zone was looked into here, something we probably have to look at, obviously gating would be an issue. Possibly protecting this pedestrian crossing and gating it so that we don't have pedestrians walking around a gate that's in preemption. Would we have to physically restrict this maneuver coming through in order to keep vehicles from passing on through? And a whole other bunch of things that we would have to look at. Probably the primary difficulty might actually be installing the gates because of the limited right-of-way. So all of that would need to be looked at as part of a crossing that it looks like this. It's not just vehicle crossings, even though the Federal Railroad Administration guidelines don't specifically talk about pedestrians as part of vehicle crossings. When you have an isolated pedestrian crossing, such as this one at Gary Street, connecting these two neighborhoods, it also has to be reviewed. And so there has to be a positive barrier set up here during train operations. Otherwise, the train horn has to be sounded. And so some form of gating would need to be supplied here, something that would keep the pedestrians from walking across the tracks as the train's approaching, and then the railroad to know that it's in place and it's operating Otherwise, the train horns have to be sounded to come across this. And that could mean that some improvements need to be made in the railroad right of way, or possibly on the channel bridge or something along those lines, but that would have to be analyzed as part of this crossing. Union Pacific Rail, I wanted to give at least one example of that, and this is the Colonia crossing of the Union Pacific Rail line. This is a rather older crossing that has a number of things that actually could be installed to make improvements out here. You can notice that there's very short distance between Oxnard Boulevard and the crossing itself, so we have two vehicles that are stopped at that light. Their vehicles may actually stop over the railroad tracks, and so there could be issues of that. There is only two existing crossing gates here, so vehicle crossover is a very reality at this location, even under today's times, people trying to get around that before the train arrives, that would have to be dealt with. And then, of course, pedestrian and ADA access across this area. My recommendation would be, even though it's not required by the Federal Railroad Administration, that any crossing that we have, looking at those issues to make it better than it is today and make it safe. And then really this one can give you a good idea of pedestrian trespass that may occur, because just because you control the crossing doesn't mean a pedestrian won't be walking along the railroad tracks, either north or south of this line, and then the train engineer needs to sound the horn to make them aware that they're approaching, and therefore pedestrian trespass may be an issue that would have to be addressed on the Union Pacific line to keep the pedestrians out of the area where the train is coming. That's a really very real issue along this north-south corridor that we have. I wanted to give the council an example of an assessment report that should be done before you determine what quiet zone you might want to implement and where. This is one from the city of Rapid City, South Dakota. And SFR Engineering, I appreciate it. They took the time to speak with me on their background and their experiences with quiet zone formations. So much of this is their work, and I appreciate that they were willing to share this with us. This looked at 14 crossings in downtown Rapid City, South Dakota, very similar to what Oxnard may want to do, but they looked at a mixture of both their mainline operations as well as some of their spur lines that were going off. Basically got all of the background inventory created with the ID Railroad Administration, all the information that the Federal Railroad Administration would look in order to compare. And then they did basically a summary of what was existing out there. Did it have gates that were functioning? Did it have flashing lights that were functioning? Did it have constant warning time, as I explained before, yes or no? Just as a very quick high-level summary before they actually got into their countermeasure review. But then as part of this assessment, they basically went into each one of those crossings and started coming that they could look into doing to improve that quiet zone index to meet that train horn index. That is the equation that you have to. And that's really shown down here. It's showing that the current train horn index is about almost 5,000. Just the 4 quadrant gates gives them about a 77% reduction down to this index, costing about $350,000 for the signal work, roadway cost associated with this. But then they actually had an estimate for the annual maintenance cost that would come online. So they would basically get a value of the cost in order to create this improvement. But then they also came up with alternatives. You can see that this one is slightly different. It only has 2 gates, but they were going to install curb and gutter on one side, a raised median in the middle, keeping people from driving around the gates in close proximity, but didn't 100% remove the ability for somebody to drive on the other side and come around. And as you can see, they don't get the same value of reduction here, 67%. But the costs are a little bit less. And so they analyzed this to say, if we had less money to do this approach, were we willing to live with this as an alternative? Another example, this was a crossing where they felt like they needed to have a different design, so that they felt they needed to extend sidewalk on one side in order to shorten the gates. This one side, it basically had the same reduction factor because it was a 4 quadrant gating. You don't really get any points for the sidewalk extensions, so it's the very same format as the one we just saw before. But they also looked at an alternative. Well, what if we just got rid of this crossing? Do we need it? you saw on the aerial 14 crossings in a very close distance, they may be able to get rid of a couple of those crossings. So they analyzed, well, if we got rid of this crossing and just maintain the pedestrians crossings by a switchback system here, what would that do? And you can see the closing delivers 100% factor, takes it to zero, lower costs, but again, it's not a full improvement project out there. It's temporary and use stuff. They would probably have to come back through here and make it more permanent. But it also does allow for pedestrians to come through there. So there's a variety of ways you can look at improving a location if you're willing. All result in, well, here's their 14 cases, crossing locations, listing out the most viable improvement option, and then basically just giving that decision-making body the information to make some of the conclusions about what it would take in order to develop the quiet zone in that area. And then it ultimately gets compiled into a list like this, where if you were just looking at certain functions alone of doing full signal upgrades, doing medians and 4-quadrant gates in order to have a very high number reduction to guarantee that you have the zone, you can see that they also carried cost estimates along those various scenarios, and then would make a decision on how much they would do in each one of those areas. And so ultimately, if the city decides to move forward with a quiet zone in some area, my recommendation would be to have a company come in that's familiar with establishing quiet zones and assist us in developing an assessment report like this in order to move to the city council with that information for final direction. As far as financial, there's no direct financial impact as part of this report. There is not currently any budgeted amounts in order to investigate the railroad crossings or move forward. And so if in fact we want to move forward on this, staff is recommending that we hire in consultant assistants to be utilized in order to both expedite and do a thorough investigation of what it would need to establish quiet zones. That may just be choosing a pilot zone that we would do, or looking at the city in its entirety to give us an idea of the whole city, and then pick and choose from that area where we may want to do the quiet zone. But we can choose a pilot area and move forward with that if it's what we want to do. And then finally, as far as the next steps, identify locations with Oxnard for the potential quiet zone implementation. This is probably something that staff can do, although we don't really have the expertise to do the full analysis at this point. We would probably come back as part of the next fiscal year budget and appropriate funding to hire in a consultant to assist us on that work, evaluate the crossings, do that alternatives assessment and risk report for us, get that report done and return to council with our final recommendations for what we might want to move forward with. And of course, all along these stages involving stakeholders in the community, like our railroad operators and railroad property owners. And then based on that, if the council wants to move forward with a pilot project of some nature, then we would file a notice of intent with the federal administration and begin the process of moving forward with a quiet zone. So with that, I appreciate the time, and we will be available to answer questions from the committee and council. Thank you very much.